My name is Brad Vogel, and I am the Executive Director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. It's a long name, but it's a very simple mission, which is to tell the story of the historic preservation movement in New York City. So the New York Preservation Archive Project is a nonprofit organization located here in New York City, and we were founded in 1998, but we actually were built on earlier work by some preservationists who realized that the stories of preservation, when Grand Central Terminal was being defended by preservationists for the third or fourth time, people realized, what was the previous story? Does anyone have the records of who was involved and what issues were covered from the earlier fights? And it was in that realization that Anthony C. Wood, who was our founder and who actually wrote this book, Preserving New York, which is really the book on the preservation movement in New York City, Tony and others recognized that we really needed to create a more formalized structure to think about the preservation history in New York City and really to do the work. One that comes to mind that was actually just before my time were papers associated with Margot Gale. And Margot Gale was a very well-known preservationist in New York City. She helped lead the fight to save and landmark the Jefferson Market Courthouse, which is now the Jefferson Market Library, starting with getting the clock going up in the clock tower, which got people to pay attention to the building and know that it was there. And then that built a constituency that ultimately pushed for and got the building preserved. And today it's a beautiful, high Victorian, Ruskinian, you could even say, sort of Gothic revival building that is a beloved part of the West Village. And it serves as a library. So it's a great story. But Margot helped lead that effort. She helped work in Soho, which is another world famous, neighborhood that continues to be under pressure from development and sort of bad urban planning decisions. But the cast iron architecture there was much beloved by Margot Gale. And so she helped lead the effort that got that area designated as a historic district in the 1970s. Here in New York, we often hear complaints that too much of the city is being preserved by the development community. But if you actually look at the percentages in terms of the overall land mass of the city, it's a really minuscule portion. Because I think any preservationist here in New York City would agree that there must be balance. And in New York is both dynamism, which the world knows, but crucially, when people actually come to New York City to live or to visit, it is not just the unadulterated dynamism that draws people in or that gives people a sense of where they are. It's also the work of preservationists who have said these key elements are so special and so character defining that if you lose these things, you stand at risk of actually losing your ability to understand that you are in New York City. When you have those things at risk, people feel compelled to act. And so I think new development it has to happen in a city for a city to remain a living, growing place. But how it happens, where it happens, and how it attunes itself to what is already there, and how it avoids doing more harm than good as change comes onto the scene, those to me are the real questions. And it's what we grapple with here in New York on a constant basis. Even though, as I mentioned, there were predecessor things that led to the landmarks law in New York City, it really, in terms of the public consciousness, the demolition of Old Penn Station really did launch historic preservation out into the world and into New York City, certainly as a broader thing that the average person understood. That is a loss. People could actually see it after a time that, what has replaced it, which is notably bad and continues to be to this day, really, when you weigh it on the scales, was a loss. So today there's a plan around Penn Station to to fix up the station itself a bit, and Madison Square Garden, which sits atop it. But the real thing that people should be focused on, if you ask me and several people in the city, is the demolition that's going on around it, that would happen if this plan goes through. One of its main missions is to dig into that pre-Penn Station history. And it shows that there were people doing on all sorts of different fronts, making lists identifying buildings, calling for legislation for decades leading up to the demolition of Penn Station. So one key thing that happened in the 1950s was the passage of the Bard Act. Now, this was a man named Elbert Bard who, for decades of his life, pushed to get New York State to allow New York City to have a landmarks law. You would think that after that, too, we're set, everything is good. There have been so many times where preservationists nevertheless had to stand up and get active and protest and call out the Landmarks Commission, because the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, the LPC, is a living body of human beings who are appointed by politicians. And so, there must still be constant vigilance by various communities to make sure that the LPC is not misinterpreting the law, misapplying the law, simply failing to act. And there have been a variety of different commissioners and commission chairs over the years. So the LPC has had sort of ebbs and flows in terms of its efficacy and its coverage of landmarking around the city. Historic preservation is really the desire and then the action that goes with that desire to safeguard historic architecture in this case, but also culture for future generations. And to me, the reason that you do that is both to inform, but also to inspire. It's crucial for people who are active preservationists now and who will be in the future to learn that other people have actually engaged. They have put sweat, blood, and tears into efforts to save buildings, because that shows you the value to a society of these historic resources. So I think it's really important for people to see historic preservation as part of their cultural heritage, part of a city's sense of who it is. Without that, a city is basically an amnesiac, someone who has forgotten itself, who it is, and where it has come from. Historic preservation ensures that some of the collective city memories are kept, and that there's a coherence to the person, so to speak, that the body politic of a place goes on into the future with a sense of its own persona. Jane Jacobs represents so many things to so many different people, but I think the heart of her work was observation. She said that in order to understand a city, you literally had to observe how it functioned, what people actually did, why things were the way they were, and understand that at a low, granular, sit on your front stoop of your home and watch the sidewalk sort of way. She's often summarized by eyes on the street, the understanding that, safety literally comes from people being on the street, and serving as a sort of informal network. In New York, we think about huge skyscrapers going up, and Hudson Yards goes up as a sort of a whole neighborhood, just, well, if you can call it a neighborhood, but a whole business corporate campus pops out of a box pre-made at several hundred stories high. But Jane Jacobs is absolutely the antithesis to that. She is the other side of the story in New York, which is people who are not necessarily wealthy, people from all different walks of life who care about the special things about in their city and the human scale things in their city that work. Streets that people can walk on, a variety of different types of buildings and ages of buildings, so that there's diversity for economic purposes and there's opportunity for people. And there's a sense, again, of coherence and continuity and a sense of place that actually makes a place worth living in. Jane Jacobs really stands for all that, but she also stands for activism. She stands for getting out there and being in the street and speaking truth to power in many ways. When you think about Jane Jacobs and who she was and the time she lived in, standing up against people like Robert Moses, who was, as the book title by Robert Caro indicates, a true power broker on the scene, it's a really incredible contrast. And I think that's why people continue to look to Jane Jacobs, is that they see in her their own possibility. So the cultural side of it is that people come to New York City because they want to hear and engage with stories. New York City sends stories out to the country and has since for hundreds of years. But people come to New York City to engage in real life, tangibly, with some token or touchstone that relates to these stories that have gone out from this city. And so in terms of the economic value, it's huge. It's huge because people come here not just to go into a corporate skyscraper. They come here to engage with theater, with poetry, with walking tours of historic architecture. People come here because they want to go to a restaurant that is in a historic building that makes them feel like they are authentically here rather than a soulless place that could be anywhere. So preserving cultural and historic heritage here is really crucial to having a reason to come to New York City in the first place. You never know when your one bit of effort as an individual is going to pay off. And so I say that to encourage you to take that step. Engage in that small way, even if it's only something that feels like it's impacting a very small circle around you. Take that step. If you see a building or you see a public space that matters to you, you may look around and say, I don't even see the tools in existence, the regulatory powers or the laws or what have you, that would be necessary to protect this place. Even if they don't exist, take a step. Raise a placard. Say something. Tell somebody that it matters. Write something in the newspaper. Do anything to inject into the public forum a sense that this does matter. Someone has to start that first, because if you don't go down that path and no one speaks up, it's gone.